The silence in the wake of their laughter was always the most deafening part. It was a specific kind of quiet, thick and syrupy, saturated with the unspoken approval of what had just transpired. For Evelyn, it was the sound of her dignity being slowly dissolved. She would sit at the polished mahogany dining table, a monument to her brother Liam's success, and feel herself shrinking, becoming a ghost in her own life. Her father, Arthur, would meticulously cut his steak, his eyes fixed on his plate as if it contained the secrets of the universe. Her mother, Carol, would offer a fragile, placating smile in Evelyn's direction, a smile that said, "Don't rock the boat, dear. It's just his way." This was the carefully curated ecosystem of the Reed family, a world where peace was not a state of harmony but a regime of suppression. Its architect and chief enforcer was Liam. A decade older than Evelyn, he wasn't just her brother, he was her landlord, her creditor, and her perpetual judge. His success in the cutthroat world of tech finance had erected this beautiful, spacious house in a leafy Boston suburb, a house he had generously, fatally, offered to share with their aging parents and his struggling little sister. The offer had been a lifeline when Evelyn's art therapy practice was floundering under a mountain of student debt. She had grasped it with both hands, not realizing it was a leash. "You're too sensitive, Evie," Liam would chuckle, the sound like grinding gravel, after a particularly pointed jab about her naive little hobby of helping troubled children. "Can't you take a joke? We're just worried about you. A person needs a real career, a solid foundation." His words were always cloaked in the language of concern, a masterclass in gaslighting that left her doubting her own perceptions. Was she overreacting? Was it really just a joke? The constant, low-grade humiliation was a poison, more insidious and corrosive than any open confrontation. It was a silent violence, a death by 1,000 paper cuts, and the whole family was complicit in the bleeding. Her parents, beneficiaries of Liam's largesse, had become his silent acolytes, their gratitude a cage they dared not rattle. The true epicenter of Evelyn's despair, however, was her 7-year-old son, Oliver. With his wide, thoughtful eyes that missed nothing, he was the reason she endured, and the reason every slight felt like a physical blow. She saw the confusion in his gaze when Uncle Liam would mock his drawings or dismiss his quiet nature as weird. She saw him flinch when the dinner table conversation turned into a subtle interrogation of his mother's life choices. Evelyn was caught in a torturous paradox. The very roof she had secured to protect her son was becoming the walls of his prison. Her parental instinct to shield him was a live wire, sparking and frantic against the oppressive weight of financial dependency. This dependency was Liam's ultimate instrument of control. The family arrangement was a labyrinth of unspoken debts and unearned privileges. The help he provided had long since curdled into a sense of entitlement, a right to comment, to judge, to dominate. He held the mortgage, he'd covered their parents' medical bills, and he never, ever let them forget it. The threat of instability, of being cast out into the terrifying chasm of the Boston rental market, was a specter that haunted Evelyn's every waking moment. It was a fear that gagged her, forcing her to swallow her anger and keep the peace, a false, brittle peace purchased with the currency of her self-respect. The fragile facade of this false peace was shattered on a crisp autumn evening. It began, as it often did, with a seemingly innocuous comment from Liam about Oliver's reluctance to try out for the soccer team. It escalated into a full-blown character assassination, with Liam diagnosing the boy with a lack of grit and blaming Evelyn's coddling. But this time, something broke in Evelyn. She didn't retreat into silence. She pushed back. The argument that followed was ugly, a raw nerve exposed. And in its aftermath, as Evelyn fled to her room, she made a decision born of pure, primal need for protection. She changed the password on her personal banking app, a small, desperate fortress against a brother who had once, casually, mentioned he could probably guess her security questions. An hour later, her phone lit up. Not with a call, but with a string of text messages that turned her blood to ice. They were from Liam, and they contained screenshots of her attempted login alerts and a failed password reset request for her bank account. The final message was simple, its quiet menace more terrifying than any shout. "Why are you locking me out, Evelyn? We're family. We don't have secrets. Call me. We need to talk about this." In that moment, the last vestiges of the illusion evaporated. This was no longer about hurt feelings or insensitive jokes. This was a declaration of war. The silent violence had become overt, the financial control had revealed its true, predatory face, and the line had been irrevocably crossed. The battle for Oliver's spirit, for her own sanity, and for the basic human right to a boundary had just begun. The false peace was dead. Now, she would have to fight for a true one, no matter the cost. The phone felt like a block of ice in Evelyn's hand, the glow of Liam's message searing her retinas. "We need to talk about this." The words weren't an invitation, they were a summons. A command from the warden. The silence of her room, once a sanctuary, now pulsed with a terrifying threat. She could hear the low murmur of the television downstairs, the familiar, comforting sounds of her parents' nightly routine, and it felt like a grotesque parody of normalcy. They were sitting in the lion's den, stroking the beast's mane, oblivious to the fact it was already baring its teeth. For the next hour, Evelyn didn't move. She sat on the edge of her bed, her body rigid, listening. She heard Liam's heavy footsteps ascend the stairs, pause outside her door, a long, deliberate silence that was more intrusion than a knock, and then continue to his own study at the end of the hall. The click of his door was a gun being cocked. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. This was the silent suffering she knew so well, the forced paralysis of the prey. But tonight, the fear was different. It was cleaner, sharper. It had a purpose. He had tried to breach her last digital fortress. There was no gaslighting this, no dismissing it as a joke. This was a line, drawn in the sand and then violently crossed. The following morning, the house was a theater of quiet tension. The air at the breakfast table was thick enough to chew. Oliver, sensitive to the moods of the adults around him like a tiny barometer, pushed his cereal around his bowl, uncharacteristically quiet. "Everything all right, Evie?" her mother, Carol, asked, her voice artificially bright. "You look tired." Before Evelyn could form a lie, Liam entered, smelling of expensive aftershave and unearned authority. He didn't look at her. He poured himself a coffee and clapped a hand on Arthur's shoulder. "Dad, I've got that financial planner coming by tonight. The one I told you about. We should all sit down with him. Get a full picture of the family's assets, make sure everything's streamlined." His eyes flickered to Evelyn for a fraction of a second. The message was clear. Your assets. Your accounts. Your life. Mine to streamline. That sounds responsible, son, Arthur said, not meeting anyone's gaze. Evelyn's knuckles were white around her coffee mug. The family's assets. The audacity of it, the sheer, narcissistic entitlement, stole her breath. She was a line item on his balance sheet. Oliver was a future liability. The fight from the previous night hadn't been an argument, it had been a due diligence meeting. Later that day, the second front opened. Her phone buzzed with a call from her aunt, her mother's sister. "Evelyn, honey," her aunt's voice was laced with a syrupy, false concern that immediately set Evelyn's teeth on edge. "Your mother called me. She's so worried. She says you're causing a lot of stress for Liam, after everything he's done for you. He's under so much pressure at work, and now this. Ungratefulness? Is this about money? You know he only wants what's best for the family." The betrayal was a physical blow. Her mother hadn't comforted her, hadn't stood up for her grandson, she had mobilized the flying monkeys. This was the classic family manipulation, the triangulation designed to isolate and punish the dissenter. Evelyn managed to end the call with vague assurances, her hand trembling. She was surrounded. The walls of the beautiful house were closing in, and her own family were the jailers. That evening, the promised financial planner arrived, a slick, unsmiling man named Mr. Davos who looked more like a corporate raider than a friendly advisor. The meeting in Liam's study was an interrogation. Mr. Davos spoke of fiscal consolidation, leveraged positions, and the inherent risks of unregulated sole proprietorships, a clear dig at Evelyn's practice. Liam sat back in his leather throne, a faint, smug smile on his face as the Mun dissected her financial life with cold, clinical precision. "The primary vulnerability I see," Davos said, his gaze landing on Evelyn like a shard of glass, is the lack of a unified strategy. Separate accounts, discretionary spending on non-essential services. He gestured vaguely, encompassing her life's work. It creates instability for the entire household unit. Evelyn felt a scream building in her throat, a raw, primal thing. They were talking about her as if she were a rogue subsidiary. She looked at her parents, hoping for a flicker of defiance, of parental protection. But Carol was studying the pattern on the rug, and Arthur was nodding slowly, as if the corporate jargon made perfect sense. They were hostages who had come to love their captor. Her brother, the man who should have been her ally, her protector, was the chief architect of this hell. The betrayal was a canyon opening up inside her, so vast and empty she felt she might fall into it and never stop falling. The true breaking point, the moment the psychological drama erupted into the realm of the social thriller, came 2 days later. Evelyn had taken Oliver to the park, a desperate attempt to breathe air untainted by Liam's presence. When they returned, Oliver ran ahead into the house, eager for a snack. Evelyn followed, her spirits momentarily lifted by the simple joy on her son's face. She found him standing frozen in the doorway of the small sunroom she used as her art therapy space and personal studio. Her own feet rooted to the floor. The room was ransacked. Canvases were leaned against walls, their backs torn open. Boxes of her private client notes, confidential, sacred records of trauma and healing, were opened, their contents spilling onto the floor. Her old journals, kept from her teenage years, lay fanned out on her desk. And in the center of the violation stood Liam, holding her laptop. He looked up, not with guilt, but with impatience. "What is this, Evelyn?" he asked, his voice cold. "I was looking for the router. The internet's been spotty. I found these." He gestured with a laptop to a small pile of bank statements she kept for her business, the old, paper ones she hadn't gotten around to shredding. "Your revenue is down 30% from last quarter. You're hemorrhaging money. And you're locking me out of your accounts." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it, the violation couched in a lie about a router, the weaponization of her private financial struggle, unleashed something in her. The years of silent suffering, the gaslighting, the manipulation, the mockery of her son, the enlistment of her family against her, the cold-blooded financial pressure, it all coalesced into a white-hot fury. "Get out," she whispered, her voice trembling with the force of her emotion. "Excuse me." "Get out of my room," she said, louder, stepping forward. "You do not get to come in here. You do not get to touch my things. You do not get to see my statements. Get out. Now." Oliver started to cry, a soft, terrified whimper from the doorway. Liam's face contorted from cool superiority to raw anger. He took a step towards her, his presence suddenly massive and threatening in the small room. "This is my house. Every square inch. There is no your room. There is no your things. I am trying to save this family from your financial incompetence, and this is the thanks I get? This hysterical ingratitude." He waved the laptop, his voice rising to a roar that shook the windows. "You are a child. An irresponsible, selfish child who has no concept of the real world. And I will not let you drag our parents and that boy down with you." That was it. The final thread snapped. The mention of Oliver, that boy, as if he were a problem to be managed, broke the last of her restraint. The parental protection, so long suppressed, erupted. "Don't you ever talk about him that way," she screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. She launched herself at him, not to hit him, but to grab her laptop, to wrench her property from his hands. It was a chaotic, desperate struggle. He was stronger, but her fury was elemental. They wrestled for the computer, a grotesque dance in the middle of the ransacked room. Her father appeared in the doorway, his face ashen. "Stop it. Both of you. What is happening?" Arthur cried out, his voice weak against the storm. With a final, brutal wrench, Liam ripped the laptop from her grasp. He held it high, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing with triumphant fury. "See? See what she's become? This is what I have to deal with." And in that moment, suspended in the wreckage of her sanctuary, with her son sobbing and her father paralyzed, Evelyn saw the truth with terrifying clarity. This was not a family. This was a system of control, and she was the non-compliant component. Keeping the false peace was no longer an option. It was suicide. The cost was her soul and her son's well-being. She stood up straight, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked Liam directly in the eye, her own gaze now shockingly clear and steady. "No," she said, her voice low but cutting through the aftermath of the scream. "This is what I have to deal with. And I'm done." She turned, walked to her weeping son, and scooped him into her arms. She didn't look back at her brother, or her helpless father. She carried Oliver out of the room, out of the wreckage, and up to her bedroom, locking the door behind her. The lock clicked into place, a small, futile gesture against a man who owned the door, but a monumental one for her. It was the first, solid, unbreachable boundary she had ever drawn. The battle was not over. It had just begun. But in that moment, holding her terrified son in the locked room, Evelyn Reed was no longer a victim. She was a mother, a warrior, and she was ready to burn his perfect, poisonous world to the ground to save her child. The false peace was ashes. Now, she would wage war for a true one. The click of the lock was a sound that echoed far beyond the bedroom door. It was a line drawn in steel, the first definitive boundary Evelyn had ever established against the silent war waging in her own home. On the other side of the door, she could hear the muffled, furious baritone of Liam's voice, no doubt delivering his version of events to their paralyzed parents. But inside, wrapped in the fragile sanctuary of the locked room, a profound shift had occurred. The paralyzing fear had been burned away in the crucible of her rage, leaving behind a cold, clear-eyed resolve. She held Oliver until his sobs subsided into hiccuping breaths, his small body finally going limp with exhaustion in her arms. She smoothed his hair, her voice a soft, steady murmur, a stark contrast to the storm that had just raged. "It's okay, my love. Mommy's here. It's all going to be okay." She wasn't sure if she was comforting him or herself, but the words, spoken aloud, felt like a vow. That night, while the house slept, or pretended to, Evelyn worked. By the light of her phone, she drafted an email. It was not emotional. It was not a plea. It was a declaration of terms. She addressed it to Liam, with a copy to her parents. "Liam," it began, bypassing any familial pretense. "Your actions today, entering my private space without permission, handling my confidential client documents, and attempting to seize my property, are unacceptable and constitute harassment. The family arrangement is no longer tenable. Oliver and I will be leaving. We require 30 days to secure new housing. During this time, you will not enter my personal space or communicate with me unless it is directly related to logistical necessities of our departure. Any further attempts to contact my financial institutions, my clients, or to discuss me with extended family will be considered escalation, and I will respond accordingly." She did not threaten legal action outright. The suggestion was a specter in the clean, clinical language. She was no longer speaking the language of a hurt sister, but that of a party terminating a toxic contract. She hit send at 3:17 a.m. The whoosh of the digital message leaving her inbox felt like the slamming of a prison gate behind her. The response was not immediate. The following morning, the house was a tomb. The silence was no longer oppressive, it was strategic, a Cold War armistice. Her parents avoided her eyes at breakfast, their faces etched with a confusion that bordered on betrayal. How dare she disrupt the peace? Their silent accusations seemed to scream. But they said nothing. Liam was absent, likely already at his office, fortifying his own defenses. His reply came just before noon. It was predictably devoid of any acknowledgement of his actions, any apology. It was a bulleted list of financial realities. Per our agreement, you are responsible for 40% of the household utilities and property taxes for the notice period. A detailed invoice is attached. The security deposit you initially provided upon moving in was applied to outstanding family debts, as previously discussed. It is non-refundable. You will be responsible for any damages to your living areas upon move-out inspection. I expect a forwarding address for any future correspondence. It was a masterpiece of narcissistic injury, a retreat into the cold, hard numbers where he held all the power, a final attempt to reduce her departure to a transaction she was losing. But for the first time, Evelyn saw it for what it was, the desperate flailing of a man who had lost his primary tool of control, her presence. He could keep the deposit. He could send his invoices. He no longer held her fear. The next 30 days were a whirlwind of quiet, determined activity. Evelyn's art therapy practice, which Liam had so derided, became her salvation. She reached out to a colleague, explaining her situation in broad strokes. The network of professional women, many of whom had faced their own battles, closed ranks around her. One had a small, furnished guest house behind her home that was currently vacant. It was modest, a fraction of the size of Liam's mansion, but it was private, and the rent was something she could manage by taking on 2 additional clients. It was a life raft. Packing their belongings felt like an archaeological dig through a life of subjugation. Every book, every toy of Oliver's, every piece of her own art she boxed felt like a reclaiming of territory. Her parents watched the process with a growing, dawning horror. The false piece was being physically dismantled, box by box, and the reality of the true, festering discord was being exposed. 2 days before the move, her father found her alone in the kitchen. "Evelyn, this is drastic," he began, his voice frail. "Your brother. He has his ways, but he loves you. He's provided for us. Can't you just talk to him? Forgive." Evelyn stopped what she was doing and looked at him. The parental protection she had craved from him would never come. He was too broken, too bought. "Dad," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Talking is what got us here. Forgiveness requires an apology, and an apology requires the capacity to admit wrongdoing. Liam possesses neither. My only job now is to protect Oliver. And myself. That is not up for discussion." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for a fleeting moment, she saw something like shame flicker in his eyes before he nodded slowly and shuffled away. It wasn't the vindication she might have once dreamed of, but it was something, an acknowledgement, however reluctant, of her agency. The day of the move was bright and cold. Her friends, 2 colleagues from her practice, arrived with a small van. The physical act of carrying her boxes out of Liam's house, under the watchful, silent gaze of her mother weeping by the staircase, was the most empowering moment of Evelyn's adult life. Liam, of course, was absent. A final, petulant power play. It suited her just fine. As her friend's car pulled away from the curb, Evelyn didn't look back at the beautiful, oppressive facade. She looked instead at Oliver, buckled in beside her, his face pressed to the window, watching his old life shrink away. He was quiet, but his eyes were wide with something that wasn't fear. It was anticipation. The guest house was small, filled with someone else's furniture, and smelled faintly of pine cleaner. The first night, they ate pizza on the floor, surrounded by towers of boxes. It was chaotic, uncertain, and utterly perfect. For the first time in years, the air she breathed was her own. The silence was not a weapon, it was a blanket. This was not the false piece of suppression, it was the true, hard-won piece of sovereignty. Weeks turned into months. The invoices from Liam stopped coming after the first one she ignored. The frantic, manipulative texts from her mother gradually dwindled into occasional, stilted requests for pictures of Oliver. The war was over. She had simply left the battlefield. One evening, sitting on the small porch of the guest house, Evelyn watched Oliver chase fireflies in the twilight. His laughter, once so rare and fragile in the grand house, was now a frequent, robust sound that filled the small yard. He was no longer quiet and watchful, he was a little boy, unafraid. He ran up to her, a captured firefly cupped carefully in his hands. "Look, Mommy," he whispered, his eyes shining in the dim light. "It's not scared. It's just bright." Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat. She looked at her son, then at the small, safe space she had built for them, and finally back at the soft, pulsating light in his hands. He was right. The world was still full of darkness, but they were no longer defined by it. They had carved out their own pocket of peace, a peace built not on the absence of conflict, but on the profound, unshakable presence of freedom. The silent violence was gone. All that remained was the quiet, steady rhythm of their own lives, finally, blessedly, their own. 2 years later. The air in Evelyn's studio smelled of turpentine, acrylics, and the faint, sweet scent of the jasmine plant thriving on the windowsill. Afternoon light, golden and forgiving, streamed through the large north-facing window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the wake of her moving brush. This was her space, not a borrowed sunroom in a house of shadows, but a proper studio in the small, clapboard cottage she now owned. The down payment had been a monumental effort, a scramble of saved sessions and a small, hard-won grant for art therapists working with at-risk youth. It was hers. The deed, a simple piece of paper, felt more like a shield and a banner than any document ever had. The cottage itself was a world away from Liam's cold, curated mansion. It was filled with Oliver's artwork, with textiles from local markets, with books stacked comfortably on floor-to-ceiling shelves. It was vibrantly, unapologetically lived in. The silence here was a companion, not a threat. It was the quiet of contentment, punctuated by the chatter of squirrels in the old oak tree outside and the distant, happy shouts of children from the park down the street. A timer chimed softly on her phone. Evelyn carefully cleaned her brush, her movements deliberate and calm. It was time to pick up Oliver. The familiar ritual, grabbing her keys from the bowl by the door, slipping on her sandals, was still a small, daily pleasure. Each action was a reaffirmation of her autonomy. She drove the short distance to the elementary school, a route she now knew by heart. The school was a bright, modern building, a stark contrast to the private, pressure cooker environment Liam had once insisted was the only option. Here, Oliver was simply Oliver. Not that boy, not a problem to be managed. She saw him before he saw her. He was standing with a small group of friends, not in the center of the boisterous chatter, but comfortably on its periphery, a genuine, easy smile on his face as he listened to another boy's animated story. His teacher said he was thoughtful, kind, and had a surprising, dry wit that emerged when he felt safe. He felt safe. His eyes lit up when he spotted her. Mom. Jason's mom said I can go to their house for an hour. They got a new puppy. Can I? Please? The request was effortless, a normal kid asking for a normal privilege. There was no hesitation, no fear of a reprisal for imposing or for the simple act of wanting something. Of course, sweetie, Evelyn said, her heart swelling. Just text me when you're ready to be picked up. She watched him run off with his friend, his backpack bouncing, his entire being radiating a lightness that had been systematically crushed out of him in his former life. This was the true victory. Not the financial independence, not the cottage, but this, her son's unburdened childhood. Later that evening, as she was preparing dinner, her phone buzzed. It was her mother. Their communication had settled into a fragile, distant rhythm, mostly photos of Oliver, brief texts on birthdays. The deep, festering wound of her mother's silent complicity had scarred over, but the tissue was still numb. Carol had never truly apologized, she had simply learned to stop asking Evelyn to be the bigger person, which was perhaps the only piece their relationship could now sustain. The message was about Arthur. His health, never robust, was declining. There was a new specialist, a confusing prognosis. The subtext, as always, was a quiet, desperate plea for Liam to fix it, for Liam to manage it. The dynamic had not changed, it had only calcified in their absence. Evelyn felt a pang of sorrow, not for the situation, but for her parents, who had traded their agency for a gilded cage and now found themselves trapped within it as the walls began to close in. She sent back a kind, measured response, offering to speak with the doctor herself if it would help, but carefully sidestepping any financial or logistical entanglement. She had learned to hold her boundaries with a gentle, unshakable firmness. She thought of Liam then. She'd heard snippets through the brittle grapevine of extended family. He had been promoted again. He had bought a larger, more impressive house. The narrative he projected was one of unassailable success. But Evelyn sometimes wondered about the silence he must return to in that big, empty house. The narcissist, deprived of his audience, was left with only the hollow echo of his own grandeur. She felt no hatred, no burning desire for revenge. What she felt was something closer to a distant, clinical pity. He was a man who could own properties but not peace, who could command respect in a boardroom but not the genuine love of a family. His victory was a spreadsheet, hers was the laughter echoing from her son's room. After dinner, Oliver was in the backyard, attempting to teach a patient, flop-eared rabbit he'd befriended to navigate a small obstacle course he'd built. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window, watching him. The setting sun cast a long, warm shadow across the lawn she mowed herself. She looked around her small, warm kitchen, at the dishes in the sink, the crayon drawing stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet, the vibrant, half-finished canvas waiting for her in the studio. It was not a perfect life. There were bills to pay, worries about the future, the lingering ache of a fractured family. But it was an authentic one. Every challenge was hers to meet, every joy was hers to claim. The false peace, the one bought with dignity and silence, was a forgotten ghost. This, the messy, beautiful, sometimes difficult reality, was true peace. It was the peace of boundaries respected, of a self-reclaimed, of a child's spirit, once folded in on itself, now blossoming freely under the sun. She stepped outside into the cool evening air, walking over to sit on the grass beside her son. The rabbit hopped away, and Oliver leaned against her, his head on her shoulder. They sat there in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to prick the deep indigo sky. No words were needed. The battle was over. The war was won. And in the quiet, ordinary perfection of the aftermath, they were finally, completely, home. Another 3 years had passed. The silence that was once deafening and threatening had now become the melody of their lives, calm, predictable, and filled with meaning. Evelyn stood on the threshold of her studio, looking at 2 paintings standing side by side on easels. They were ready for an exhibition at a local gallery, her first solo exhibition. One depicted Oliver, laughing, with that very same firefly in his hands, his face illuminated not only by the insect's light but by an inner radiance that no one could ever extinguish again. The second painting was more abstract, a dark, threatening silhouette of a house, gradually dissolving and turning into a flock of birds flying against a rising sun. She had named it Letting Go of the Ghosts. Oliver was now 12. He had navigated all the usual complexities of adolescence, but he did so on the solid foundation of safety and self-respect that he and his mother had built together. He was no longer that quiet, intimidated boy who was afraid of his own uncle. He was a person, witty, sometimes sarcastic, passionate about science fiction and programming. The irony was not lost on Evelyn. Her son, whom Liam had deemed weird and unpromising, was now excelling in a field his uncle considered his own domain, but he did it out of pure curiosity and joy, not a thirst for control. The day of the exhibition opening was a warm autumn evening. The gallery was full of people, her clients, colleagues, parents of the children she worked with, Oliver's friends. The air was filled with the hum of lively conversation and laughter. Evelyn, in a simple, elegant dress she had bought with her own money, for her own event, felt not like she was suffering from imposter syndrome, but like she was exactly where she belonged. Oliver approached her, holding 2 glasses of apple cider. "Mom, look," he said quietly, nodding towards the entrance. Carol was standing in the doorway. She stood alone, looking older and smaller than Evelyn remembered. In her hands was a small, modest bouquet of autumn flowers. Their eyes met across the room. Evelyn saw not reproach or a plea, but something new, a timid respect, mixed with an abyss of regret. She slowly approached her mother. "Evelyn," Carol's voice trembled. "The paintings. They are beautiful." "Thank you for coming, Mom," Evelyn replied softly. Carol handed her the flowers. Your father wanted to come, but he wasn't feeling well." A pause hung in the air, heavy with everything left unspoken. "Liam bought a new house. A very big one. He is very lonely there." Evelyn simply nodded. There was no schadenfreude or triumph in these words for her. It was merely a statement of fact. Her brother had built himself a mausoleum, not a home. He had chosen power over connection, control over love. And now he was reaping the consequences of that choice. Carol stayed for a short while, bought a small print of the rabbit in the backyard, a nod to the stories Oliver had told her over the phone, and left as quietly as she had appeared. It was not a breakthrough, not a magical reconciliation. It was a bridge, fragile and narrow, cast across the chasm of years of silent approval of abuse. Perhaps one day they would be able to cross it towards each other, and perhaps not. And Evelyn was at peace with that. Her world no longer depended on their approval or presence. Later that evening, when the guests had departed and the gallery was empty, Evelyn and Oliver walked home. Their shadows lengthened under the streetlights. "Are you proud of yourself, Mom?" Oliver asked, taking her hand. His question caught her off guard. She had been thinking about her successes, the studio, the exhibition. "You know," she said, stopping and looking at him, "I am proud of us. I am proud of you. But yes, today I feel pride. And peace." He smiled. "Me too." Evelyn Reed's story is not a fairy tale about instant success or a complete severing of all ties. It is a story of slow, difficult recovery, woven from everyday acts of courage. It is a reminder that tyranny is not always loud. Often it manifests in poisonous jokes, in silent approval, in the financial strings that pull one like a marionette. It taught her that keeping the peace at any cost is the most destructive lie a victim can accept. That false peace is merely a lull in the war against one's own self. True peace, as Evelyn discovered, is noisy, messy, and imperfect. It comes after the battle you have fought for yourself. It smells of paint and apple cider, it sounds like the laughter of your child who is no longer afraid, and it feels like the weight of your own keys to your own home. Her journey showed that setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but an act of deep love, for oneself and for those one is duty-bound to protect. Sometimes the strongest parental protection is not a shield held up against the blows, but the decision to permanently lead the child away from the battlefield. And most importantly, Evelyn's story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It proves that even from under the rubble of toxic relationships, financial dependence, and broken trust, one can build a new life. Not a perfect one, but a real one. A life in which every sunrise, every deep breath of free air, and every moment of quiet, untainted joy is a victory. And that victory is worth any price.